A community energy plan benefits planners as a robust foundation for climate change policy. As we learned in the last module, Canadian communities can expect to play a stronger role in energy planning and decision-making as our energy system continues to go local, aided by the technology innovations that were described in Module 2. A modern energy transition is well underway, and local governments are responding to the needs to integrate new energy systems into the local landscape. Let's watch a short presentation of Dr. Kirby Calvert from the University of Guelph discussing the impacts that new energy systems will have on rural and urban landscapes, and the role that local governments can play in managing the energy transition.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Kirby Calvert. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment and Geomatics at the University of Guelph. And I've been asked to speak with you today about the transition to distributed renewable energy production, and more specifically about what this transition means for local planners, both land use planners and energy planners. As you can see, I wear a couple of other hats. I'm also the co-director of the Community Energy Knowledge Action Partnership, along with my counterpart, co-director Ian McVeigh. And I'm also the co-chair of Our Energy Guelph, which is a not-for-profit that has been tasked with implementing Guelph's community energy plan. So I want to talk a little bit about this transition from both an academic perspective, based on some of the insights that I've gleaned through my research, and also from a practical perspective, based on the insights and experiences that I've had through co-directing CCAP and co-chairing Our Energy Guelph.
The first point I want to make is that the transition toward distributed renewable energy systems is at the same time a profound landscape transformation. So the image that you're seeing on the screen is a typical example of how we might interact with energy production infrastructure in our everyday lives. So this is a cooling tower. It's part of a large nuclear-powered electricity generation system somewhere in central Pennsylvania. And as you learned in previous modules, our energy system is currently very centralized. Fuels are dug up somewhere in the world and moved from that location to another location hundreds to thousands of miles away, where those fuels are ultimately converted into more useful forms of energy in very large centralized systems. And those systems are located typically out of sight, out of mind. And we might see a cooling tower or we might see a smokestack once in a while, as we're seeing here on the screen. But generally speaking, we don't interact in a very direct way with this infrastructure on a regular basis. In contrast, renewable energy needs to be converted on site, and it needs to be converted above ground. So now as we're driving down the highway in an area that has transitioned toward renewable energy systems, these are the landscapes that we are likely to confront. So on the top left, you're seeing a wind farm on the North Shore Lake Erie in Ontario, Canada, amidst an apple orchard. And in the bottom left, you're seeing one of Ontario's larger wind farms off the coast of Kingston, Ontario, on Wolfe Island in Lake Ontario. The top right, you're seeing one of Ontario's largest ground mount solar farms down in Sarnia. It's about an 80 megawatt facility covering about 440 hectares of land. And in the bottom right, you're seeing an example of a biogas digester, one of North America's largest. It's about a 3 megawatt system, converts waste into gas, into electricity. And that's located in Elmira. So these are the kinds of landscapes that you're likely to confront as you now drive down the highway. And the other thing to note is that these systems introduce trade-offs in land-based economies, in land-based ecosystem services, and landscape aesthetics. And these trade-offs really need to be understood and managed. Now, you might be thinking that we can avoid all of this by simply developing more rooftop solar energy or integrating renewables into existing infrastructure. We definitely need to capture as much of that as possible. And I don't want to dismiss that. But realistically speaking, under the technologies and the systems designs that will drive the energy transition over the next several decades, building integrated renewable energy systems will not be enough. And I want to make that case with some research that I was involved with in the city of Philadelphia. So what we did was we used various geographic information systems to identify all of those rooftops that could technically host a renewable energy system. In this case, a photovoltaic system. So don't worry too much about the details in the map to the left. That's just to show you that we have identified all of those individual rooftops and rooftop facades. And when we added it all up, we found that only about 30 to 50% of total electricity currently consumed in the city could be produced if all of these rooftops were covered with PV systems. And I bolded currently consumed because we know that the quantity of electricity consumed in any given city is going to change. It's going to decrease as a result of efficiency and conservation measures, but it's also going to increase as we shift toward electric heating and electric vehicles. So what this suggests is that we are necessarily going to need to sprawl our energy system in order to recover sufficient quantities of energy to maintain our modern lifestyles. That's an example from one city, but study after study has come up with this number in other cities, about 30 to 50%, sometimes 60, sometimes 70, but never 100% of total electricity, and certainly never 100% of total energy when you add in heat and transport. The other point I want to make is that the land use trade-offs that I was describing and the landscape trade-offs I was describing will be experienced by a much larger percentage of the population, precisely because renewable energy systems are spatially distributed and land intensive. And I want to use data from Ontario to help make this point. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a map of the energy production infrastructure in Ontario as of about the year 2000. So this includes electricity generation facilities and fuel production facilities. I'll give you a moment to identify the petroleum refining, the large coal systems, large nuclear systems, the triangles, and of course the most spatially prevalent, the blue dots there, the hydroelectricity facilities across Ontario. Since the year 2000, when these data, the year that represented by these data, the province has seen various market transformations and policy incentives to facilitate the development of renewable electricity as well as renewable fuels. And so if we take a look at what this looks like now in about 2016 to 2017, we see that the number of communities who are hosting large-scale electricity or fuel production systems has dramatically increased. So I'm only showing here the large-scale systems, that is the utility-scale electricity systems and the large-scale fuel systems. I'm not showing the small-scale wind and small-scale solar. Each of these dots and boxes and triangles represents a community, not necessarily a single system. I've mapped these just by city centroid. So each of those red dots in particular, which represents feed-in tariff projects across Ontario, might represent up to 6 projects in that particular municipality.
So what does this all mean for local planners? Well, there's a lot to unpack here, and I just want to start with 3 high points that will hopefully serve as food for thought and stimulate some dialogue. I think the first important role is to get to work assessing local renewable electricity and renewable fuel generation potential. And I suggest this for 2 reasons. One, so that we can improve the way in which we communicate with the general public around our renewable energy targets. So there's often an assumption among the general public that the targets a city might set for its renewable energy generation will be satisfied through local resources. And that is very rarely the case. As I hope to have shown, it is not technically possible to recover 100%, and in some cases even a fraction of a percentage of total energy consumption within a given city. And so assessing local potential will improve communication around that. The other reason I think it's important to assess local potential is because it will put you in a position to anticipate likely developments, to to anticipate where local renewable energy is going to be recovered. Many of the decisions that are made involve landowners and developers, and it would be beneficial, I think, for local planners to anticipate which landowners and which developers are likely to consider these opportunities. And this brings me to my second point, making space for renewable energy by integrating energy considerations into land use planning. So with a detailed assessment of local generation potential, it becomes possible to identify possible potential land use impacts associated with that development and to plan around that. So examples might include identifying opportunity areas for renewable energy development. Those opportunity areas might emerge after removing from consideration all areas that are considered sensitive, locally sensitive ecological habitats or locally significant land cover types. And so with maps of local generation potential, you can then overlay that with maps of environmental protections and other land cover protections to identify opportunity areas for development, exclusive of those environmental protections. Another way would be to think about writing solar access bylaws. With more solar panels being scattered across homes and fields, we might need to anticipate potential conflicts between those systems and the aspirations of neighbors to, say, build a third story on their house or plant a fast-growing tree that might shade and restrict access to the sun from the existing system. And a lot of what I've talked about revolves around very particular technologies and system designs that are going to change as markets and technologies evolve. So for this reason, I think it's important for planners to foster participation in partnerships, convening regular discussions with utilities, developers, and the general community to stay on top of emerging opportunities, to think through how changing market structures and changing technologies are going to manifest themselves differently across the community, with new technologies being developed. And especially because these technologies are so land intensive, they are above ground, they're visible. An effective way in which to convene these discussions is through participatory mapping exercises. So bringing the maps of local generation potential overlaid with prevailing land use plans into the conversation to talk about where these resources might be recovered in ways that can meet utility objectives, can ensure viability for developers, and are consistent with what the general community expects of its energy future. So surely there's more. I don't intend for this to be an exhaustive list, but I do hope that it has served as a starting point for conversations. If you're interested in learning a bit more about the issues that I've described here, digging deeper into the conversation, please feel free to reach out to me personally. I'd be happy to chat about where this all goes from here. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your course and hope to meet you in person. Thank you.
While many communities began to address climate change some time ago, the undeniable escalation in severe weather has caused many more to step up. Scientists agree, without a reduction in carbon emissions, we can expect severe weather to continue to impact our daily lives, infrastructure, safety, and financial resources. Community energy planning can identify community energy solutions that, in addition to mitigating climate change, help a community adapt to a changing climate. Let's listen to Quest's Eddie Oldfield describe the participatory mapping process.
Okay, we've been doing participatory mapping for roughly about 7-8 years, and we basically go into each individual community with a map of their community. And so for example, some of the outcomes of that work, where we're engaging community stakeholders to use maps and plan forward, we have 12 communities currently in Canada undergoing a full climate risk assessment and adaptation strategy development. And we use the map as a way to look at where are the hazards, so the risks, what are the vulnerabilities, what are the opportunities for improvement, what are the local strengths and assets that they currently have, but also where do they need to go going forward. And what's really interesting is you have various staff from one municipal government come into a room and participate, and there'll be a lot of aha moments, like, I didn't know that you knew this, or we didn't know that this was needed, or there was not a lot of cross-collaboration across departments. So it was a really good tool to allow that conversation to happen in a constructive fashion between water and works, or planning, or administration, finance, and so on. So it was really interesting to use a map as a tool, an engagement tool rather. And land use plays a really critical component in making decisions around disaster risk reduction. So that would be one example of an outcome from this work. The energy planning side of it, we've done a lot of training type of workshops. So where we will go into a community that may not really understand all the ins and outs of energy decision making. Because typically municipal governments don't have that background. They're not making key decisions around energy. They're paying the energy bill at the end of the month. But now increasingly we're seeing communities making decisions around energy. And so we go in and we do this map-based exercise. It takes a couple of hours, and we actually lead them through a series of steps which follow the principles of smart energy communities, starting with efficiency first, moving to looking at how to harness waste energy resources, looking at potentially renewable heat or renewable power sources, incorporating those into conventional energy networks, also looking at, of course, land use and transportation, because land use has a huge impact over the long term. So those are steps in the exercise. Each step requires the participants at the table to mark up the maps so that at the end of the day, they're sharing knowledge, they're learning about energy decision making, and they're also visioning what their community will look like going forward. So it's an incredibly useful and visual tool to get decision makers on board.
Global urbanization is proceeding at an unprecedented rate. More than half of the world's population lives in urban settlements, and by 2050, it will be more than 2/3. This trend is even more prevalent in Canada, where more than 85% of our population lives in cities and towns. Urban centers provide remarkable opportunities for people, including greater access to employment and basic services like healthcare and education. Urbanization stimulates economic growth, increases rates of literacy and education, the status of women, and fosters sustainability. If well managed, essential services like transportation, housing, water, and sanitation can be offered less expensively and with a lower environmental footprint compared to less dense suburban and rural populations. Modern Canadian urban centres have been designed and built for the use of fossil fuels. Community energy planning will help rewrite the urban energy chapter and ensure the benefits of the modern energy transition are broadly shared. The energy transition is disrupting traditional business models and the jobs that go with them. Increasingly, there are calls for ensuring a just transition, so the introduction of new energy technologies does not come at the expense of workers, Indigenous peoples, or marginalized communities. Community energy planning can work to ensure the benefits are shared broadly across society. Community energy planning is a tool to proactively address the complex set of trends impacting communities. It provides a structured approach for local governments and community stakeholders to respond to emerging challenges while realizing benefits from the energy transition. In this section, we present an overview of the process to set the stage for the next section, which covers the multitude of benefits that can be realized through the practice of community energy planning. The first step in developing a community energy plan is to answer questions like, what is our energy and emissions profile? How much money does our community spend on energy each year? This establishes a community's starting point, a baseline. All strategies need a goal. This means answering this question: what do we want our future energy and emissions profile to look like? To design an effective strategy, you need to understand what it will take to reach your goal. This means answering this question: what will our future energy and emissions profile look like if we do nothing? Understanding the risks of business as usual, BAU, is usually a compelling reason to act. Once a community knows where they are headed, and where they would rather be, they can build the right strategy to change course. That strategy needs to be supported by an action plan to document initiatives that can be implemented in a 3 to 5 year timeframe to support the long-term strategy, and a commitment to implement, monitor, and report on progress. Regular updating ensures new opportunities are captured. Before setting a new course, it is helpful to understand current and emerging trends that may influence your strategy, some of which we covered earlier in this module, as well as the benefits you may accrue along the way.